So fascism is an ideology that we talked about. So within fascism is another ideology, militarism, and fascism itself is an ideology, or is a subset of an ideology called totalitarianism, which aims to control all aspects of human society. So fascism develops in the interwar period, which we had discussed about in the last YouTube video. Italy and Germany become fascist countries. They have an emphasis on anti-democracy. Um, they think democracy is for weak people. Democracy brings weakness. There's this emphasis on community decline, this idea that Germany has fallen and they need to be made great again, etc. There's also this idea that violence can help purge and clean out society. So this glorification of violence and this very militaristic ideology. So there you can see a picture of um, fascists in Germany, and here's a slide on Nazi ideology. So Hitler promoted ultranationalism and scientific racism. So he also promoted anti-Semitism, and you can see some key events in Nazi Germany. So obviously there are a lot of World War II movies out, but there's this great recent satire called Jojo Rabbit. So if you're looking to watch something, there's a link in the description. It obviously talks about the adoption of a hateful ideology like Nazism, and kind of pokes fun at the ridiculousness of that. So this is just a refresher of what Europe looked like after World War One, and then of course the map completely changed with in the aftermath of World War II and during World War II. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed to end World War I. This is just your roadmap to World War II. 1925, Hitler writes Mein Kampf from jail. Long story short, he tries to start a coup d'etat. Mein Kampf translates to My Struggle, where he talks about all these kind of anti-Semitic ideas and espouses his political philosophy. 1929, of course, is the stock market crash that leads to the Great Depression. And of course, this leads to eventually Hitler comes into power in 1933. So Germany annexes territory. It begins its process of expansion. So German-Austrian unification takes place in this short period from 1936 to 1939. In 1938, Hitler sought Sudetenland, a region of mostly German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia. And basically, the policy by the British and the French is appeasement. They don't want to start another war. So Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at that time, he believes that appeasement is the best solution to appease Hitler and avoid another world war. Of course, this appeasing doesn't work. In 1939, Hitler invades Poland, which France and Britain eventually declare as a red line, and World War I begins. Prior to what most historians agree is the start of World War II, which is the 1939 invasion of Poland, Japan had been expanding for a while, so you can see territory of Japanese expansion in this following map. You can see that they expanded to China and Korea, which has implications we'll see for the turning of China communist, and also has implications in terms of today's politics, so Korean resentment of Japan, for instance. So there's obviously the World War II has a huge cost on civilians, the rape of Nanking, the Japanese brutally sack the city of Nanking in China. Obviously the final solution, which is the Holocaust, which we'll talk about separately in terms of the advancement of human rights. Also comes with huge civilian casualties. There's tons of civilian casualties in World War II. You can see the statistics about the cost of war in the next slide. So these are the leaders. The main leaders for the Allies were Stalin. He was the leader of the Soviet Union. We talked about Stalin previously. FDR, and then Winston Churchill versus Hitler, the leader of Germany, Mussolini, the leader of Italy, and Hirohito, the emperor of Japan. Originally, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and Germany had won a series of battles thanks to their Blitzkrieg strategy, which was lightning war. They were incredibly capable. They take over France in 1940, and then they turn on the Soviet Union. They invade the Soviet Union, and then Stalin eventually has to enter the fray. Winston Churchill is known for being a very good leader. In 1940, Britain faced a brutal bombing campaign by Nazi Germany called the Bombing of Britain. Um, and Winston Churchill had to decide whether to come up with an agreement with Germany or not. So there's this great movie called the that is a biopic about Winston Churchill called uh, The Darkest Hour. It's just really really good. So I would go and see it. It really gets at how charismatic Winston Churchill was as a leader and how important he was. He famously gave a speech before Parliament, saying that they would fight on the beaches, the landing grounds, and that they would never surrender before Nazi Germany. So one of the major turning points of World War II was the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor because the United States enters the war. The Japanese had expected to significantly deplete the strength of the United States, but it does not. They attack the fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and this becomes a really turning point because the United States also enters the war. In 1942, there's the Battle of Stalingrad and then D-Day, which we've all seen popularized in the movie Saving Private Ryan. I included links on both of these specific events, but Hitler, just like Napoleon before him, invades Russia, and this Russian invasion, or specifically the Soviet Union, the Russian winter is brutal. The Soviets eventually are successfully able to push them back at Stalingrad, and then that marks the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany begins to collapse. On the Western Front, the Allies, including the United States, France, and Britain, are closing in. The Germans launch this last-ditch effort, and it's called the Battle of the Bulge because the Germans managed to create a bulge in the lines of the Allies on the Western Front, but it's eventually unsuccessful, and the Allies push them back. And then on the east, the Soviet Union begins to close in on Germany. The Soviet Union then takes Berlin, the capital of Germany, and you can see this doctored image. It was a doctored image, but it was an image that was taking place, a staged image, I should say, of the Soviets raising the hammer and sickle over the Berlin Reichstag. There's a cool Call of Duty campaign on this, which I'll include in the description, where you actually storm the Reichstag. It's part of the campaign. Of course, victory in Japan takes a different form. So the United States, FDR actually dies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he never sees the end of World War II. Truman takes over, and he makes the decision to unleash the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, there was a secret project called the Manhattan Project for developing the atomic bomb. It's developed, and it's used against two Japanese cities on August 6, 1945, and August 9, 1945, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, it leads to great shock around the world, and it ushers in the nuclear age. So there's a lot of fear and trepidation. And here's this great excerpt from Richard Rhodes' book entitled The Making of the Atomic Bomb. So the excerpt goes, the closing days of the Second World War marked a similar turning point in human history, the point of entry into a new era when humankind for the first time acquired the means of its own destruction. So cheap, so portable, so holocaustal did nuclear weapons eventually become that even nation states as belligerent as the Soviet Union, meaning as warlike as the Soviet Union and the United States, preferred to sacrifice a portion of their national sovereignty, preferred to forego the power to make total war rather than be destroyed in their own fury. So he's making the argument that countries become more restrained, at least after World War II, and certainly we see that play out in the Cold War. The United States and eventually the Soviet Union acquires nuclear weapons, and perhaps there's this, although these countries are engaged in a Cold War with one another, there's this effort not to enter into direct conflict with one another, at least because that would mean the destruction of the world. In 1944, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish legal scholar, created the term genocide. The term has come to be defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The Holocaust, or the final solution, which is a euphemism for the Holocaust. In it, millions of Jews, approximately 6 million, who lived in Germany and German-occupied lands, were rounded up, blamed for every conceivable problem in society, and killed. In addition, millions of Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, and political dissidents were also killed. When news of the atrocities spread after the war, public sympathy for the creation of Israel as a homeland for Jews arose. We'll talk about that later. But for right now, I just want to stamp the word genocide. It's just remember to memorize the definition. It's very important. There have been genocides in the past, and there will have been genocide. There's possible genocide taking place today in Myanmar, and there were genocides, several in the 1990s in Rwanda, for example. So obviously, the final solution, or the Holocaust, was very horrific that a lot of us already knew about. The systematic killing of Jews was horrific, but there had been, as I mentioned, genocides before and after the Holocaust. Although the international community made this promise to never again allow a Holocaust or genocide to take place, there have been several since. So we'll talk about the institutions that the world creates after the Holocaust to prevent another one from happening. We'll discuss about the efficacy or effectiveness of those institutions as well. These are some examples of mass atrocities that took place before World War II. So the Armenian genocide, make sure you get that down. There's the famine in Ukraine that was believed, according to Anne Applebaum, to be deliberate, and then the Japanese conduct against the Chinese in World War II. So mass atrocities did take place. Atrocities against civilians did take place that could be differentiated a little bit between genocides, but just grave acts and crimes against humanity, or crimes against humanity is what they would be referred to today. So we'll talk about the institutions that develop to both prevent crimes like these from happening, or events like these from happening, and to also just prevent another world war. Before I continue, I just want to also say that you could consider European conquests of the Americas and their killing of Native Americans also as a genocide. Also, the rape of Nanking, for instance, doesn't constitute a genocide, although it is a mass atrocity. A genocide has a very specific definition and involves the intent to destroy a whole people. Of course, the international community said never again after World War II, never again against a Holocaust or a Holocaust type event from ever happening. But here's a list of examples of Holocaust type events happening and genocides taking place in the 20th century, the late 20th century specifically. So the images that you see there are of the Rwandan genocide, which killed approximately 800,000 people. It was the ethnic conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsis. We talked about bystanders to genocide. Sam Power's great journalistic work in The Atlantic. I've provided a lot of you links, and a lot of you have read them. So after the Holocaust, there's this attempt to reassert human rights and to basically define them. And human rights are basically ask the question, what are human beings and what are they entitled to? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. You could see that image of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a key member of the committee for the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, basically spells them out. All people are born equal, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Also, after World War II, the Allies believed that a network of international organizations like the United Nations could reduce the probability of conflict. So the United Nations is founded by the victorious powers to help reduce the probability of conflict. It's designed to help provide an outlet and a means for countries to address grievances with one another. And it's organized as a collective security organization. And I'll explain what that means in a bit. So the United Nations is supposed to be a collective security organization. The prevention of aggression is the primary goal of a collective security organization. All states in the system agree to fight against aggressor state and to go beat up on an aggressor state if that state arises. The UN has been criticized for not being a collective security organization only because states end up being unwilling to commit to that. During the Cold War, the UN is basically irrelevant because it just becomes the Soviet Union and the United States, which are the most powerful states in the system during the Cold War, can't agree on anything, basically, in terms of intervention. And so they occupy the UN Security Council, which is the most important council at the United Nations, which determines key resolutions based on security and international security, and they can't agree on anything. So Article 2.4 of the UN Charter says members of the United Nations shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other nation. It does come with exceptions. Obviously, the exception would be self-defense if you're defending yourself against an aggressor state, and there are a series of other exceptions as well. So it comes hard against using war as a means to as a means to an end. It comes against rhetorically at least, it comes hard against the use of war. So one of the ways that you can also fight a war is if it's authorized by the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council is where the power really is in the United Nations. There are 5 permanent members to the UN Security Council, and then there are other members that are elected. But the permanent members also have veto power. So if one of them disagrees, then the resolution never gets passed. So you can imagine this comes with great complications during the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States are on the UN Permanent Security Council. So the permanent members of the UN Security Council are the P5. It's the United States, the Soviet Union, which today is Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. They're the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they basically wield all the power. We then asked the question, what was the efficacy of the world community's commitment to never again allow genocides to take place? And then I put it in the form of a thesis statement that kind of encompassed both the institutions designed not necessarily to prevent genocide, but to prevent major war, and the institutions also designed to prevent genocide, and the agreements and treaties designed to prevent genocide. I came up with this thesis. It's an argument, so you can disagree with that argument. And then I had you guys break down this thesis into topic sentences. One topic sentence that I wanted you to support with specific documents was governments only prevent genocides when it is within their national interest to do so, and then we went through that DBQ.